My name is Elodie, and before you decide if my story is one of justice or just simple revenge, I want you to do me a favor. If you've ever poured your entire life into a job only to be told you were disposable, I need you to hit that like button. It helps to know I'm not just screaming into the void, that there are others out there who understand what it feels like to be erased. And stick with me. Because this story isn't just about how I lost my world, it's about how I built a new one from the ashes. For 20 years, I was the head winemaker at the Dubois family estate. It wasn't just a job, it was a calling, a legacy I inherited not by blood but by dedication. My world revolved around a living, breathing secret, a proprietary yeast culture we called the matriarch. It was a strain unique to our cellars, discovered by accident generations ago and nurtured into the soul of our wine. It gave our award-winning vintages a character that was impossible to replicate, a whisper of wild honey, a hint of rain on warm stone. That yeast wasn't just an ingredient, it was the vineyard's entire story in a single microscopic organism, and I was its keeper. When the owner's son, Oscar, took over, he walked into my cellar with the kind of confidence only an MBA and a complete lack of experience can provide. He looked at my fermentation charts, my handwritten notes, my carefully controlled temperature logs, and he smiled a thin, dismissive smile. He called me obsolete. My methods were archaic, he said. My intuitive process, a relic. He wanted data, automation, efficiency. He didn't see a living culture. He saw a line item on a spreadsheet that could be optimized. He pushed me out with the brutal, impersonal efficiency of a man clearing old furniture from a house he just inherited. He offered me a severance package that was an insult wrapped in legal jargon and showed me the door. He assumed the matriarch was self-sustaining, a biological machine that would just keep working. But he was wrong. The vineyard's legacy wasn't in the soil, or the vines, or the expensive French oak barrels. It was in the knowledge he had just forced out the door. And now, as his first batch sours and his biggest distributor threatens to walk, he's about to learn that lesson the hard way. The meeting was an execution disguised as a transition. It took place in the main house's sterile conference room, a space I'd always hated. It smelled of lemon polish and corporate anxiety, a stark contrast to the rich, earthy scent of my cellars. Oscar sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by an HR woman I'd never seen before. He wore a suit that was too tight in the shoulders, a uniform of modern ambition that didn't fit the rustic soul of the estate. He didn't make eye contact. He spoke about the future, about modernization, about leveraging technology to scale our brand. He used words like synergies and disruption. He was giving a speech he'd probably practiced in front of a mirror, a eulogy for a past he never understood. Then he got to the point. My role, he said, was being restructured. The position of head winemaker was being eliminated, folded into a new director of operations role that he, of course, would be assuming for the interim. He slid a folder across the polished table. It stopped a few inches from my hands. I didn't touch it. He said with a finality that was meant to be kind but landed like a punch, "Elodie, your contributions have been foundational. But the future requires a different skill set." I remember the silence that followed. The HR woman looked at her papers. Oscar finally looked at me, a flicker of something, impatience, maybe guilt, in his eyes. I just nodded slowly. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply said, "I see." My composure seemed to unnerve him more than any outburst would have. He expected a fight, tears, a plea. I gave him nothing. I gave him a ghost. As I stood up, I looked at him and said, "The matriarch needs to be fed every 48 hours, Oscar. The ambient temperature can't fluctuate more than 2 degrees. She doesn't like direct sunlight." He waved a dismissive hand. "We have the logs, Elodie. It's all documented. We'll be fine." That was the moment I knew. He thought the soul of our vineyard was a checklist. He thought the heart of our legacy could be managed by an algorithm. He had no idea what he had just done. The drive home was a blur. The familiar curves of the road that wound through the valley felt alien, the landscape of a life that was no longer mine. I parked in the gravel driveway of my small cottage, a home that came with the job 20 years ago, and for the first time, I felt like a trespasser. I walked inside, closed the door, and the silence was deafening. The professional mask I had worn in that conference room crumbled, and I slid down the door, my back pressed against the wood, as the full weight of the betrayal hit me. It wasn't just the loss of a job, it was the severing of a connection, the amputation of a part of my soul. For 2 decades, my hands had been in that process, my days and nights dictated by the needs of a living thing. I had sacrificed holidays, relationships, a life outside those stone walls, all in service to that legacy. A legacy that Oscar had just wiped away with a corporate memo. The sobs came then, ragged and ugly, the kind that come from a place so deep you didn't know it existed. It was a grief for my lost purpose, for the years of devotion now rendered meaningless. It was the raw, primal scream of being erased. My mind started to drift back, a flood of memories washing over the pain. I remembered my first day at the estate. I was just a girl then, fresh out of otinology school, full of textbook knowledge and a desperate eagerness to prove myself. The owner then, Oscar's father, was a man named Arthur Dubois. He was the opposite of his son, a man whose hands were permanently stained with the earth, whose wisdom was etched in the lines around his eyes. He didn't interview me in an office. He took me down to the oldest part of the cellar, a damp, cool cavern carved into the hillside. In the center of the room, on a simple wooden pedestal, was a large, temperature-controlled glass vessel. Inside, a milky, swirling liquid pulsed with a slow, gentle life. "That," he said, his voice a low rumble, "is the matriarch. She is the beginning and the end of everything we do here." He explained that the culture wasn't just yeast, it was a complex symbiosis of multiple strains of Saccharomyces, Cerevisia, and other wild microflora, a unique ecosystem that had evolved over nearly a century within the specific microclimate of their cellar. It couldn't be recreated. It could only be sustained. Arthur became my mentor. He didn't teach me from a book. He taught me by feel, by scent, by instinct. He taught me to listen to the culture. He'd make me close my eyes and just smell the air around the vessel. "Do you smell that?" he'd ask. "That faint note of apricot? She's happy today." Or, "There's a sharpness, like green apples. She's stressed. The temperature is a half-degree too high." He taught me that caring for the matriarch was more like being a doctor than a scientist. You had to diagnose her moods, anticipate her needs. The feeding process wasn't just about adding a nutrient solution, it was a ritual. The solution had to be a specific temperature, introduced at a specific, slow rate. The vessel had to be stirred, but not with a machine. It had to be done by hand, with a long, sterilized wooden paddle, in a precise figure-8 motion. Arthur claimed the mechanical vibration of a machine was too harsh, too angry. He said the culture could feel the difference between a gentle hand and an indifferent motor. I thought it was quaint, romantic nonsense at first, the poetic ramblings of an old man. But then I saw the results. One week, Arthur was away, and the assistant winemaker at the time, a young man with a modern sensibility, much like Oscar's, decided to use a magnetic stirrer for efficiency. The yeast didn't die, but it changed. The subsequent fermentation was sluggish, and the resulting wine lacked its characteristic depth. It was technically correct, but the soul was gone. It was my first lesson. The process wasn't just tradition, it was function. The unquantifiable, intuitive parts were as critical as the measurable, scientific ones. I spent years under Arthur's tutelage, absorbing every piece of his ancestral knowledge. I learned to recognize the subtle shifts in the culture's viscosity, the way it clung to the glass, the tiny changes in its aroma that foretold its needs. It became a second language to me. When Arthur finally retired, he didn't just pass the title of head winemaker to me. He held a small private ceremony in the cellar. He placed my hand on the cool glass of the matriarch's vessel. He said, "She's yours to care for now, Elodie. She knows you, she trusts you." It was the proudest moment of my life. A sacred trust had been passed to me. It wasn't about a salary or a title. It was a covenant. And for 15 years after that, I upheld it. I nurtured the matriarch through heat waves, power outages, and seasons of bad harvests. I protected her, and she in turn gave us wine that was celebrated around the world. We won gold medals, glowing reviews, and the loyalty of distributors who valued our unique, unwavering quality. I built my life around that promise to Arthur, around that silent living entity in the cellar. The memory of Arthur's face, so full of trust, was what cut the deepest. I had failed him. I had allowed his legacy to fall into the hands of his arrogant, ignorant son. The anger began to burn through the grief, a cold, clear flame. This wasn't just an injustice, it was a desecration. Oscar didn't just fire an employee, he abandoned a sacred duty. He was a king who had cast out the keeper of the crown jewels because he thought they were just shiny rocks. My phone buzzed on the floor beside me. It was a text from Matteo, my junior winemaker, a young, passionate kid I had been mentoring, much like Arthur had mentored me. The text was short, a frantic burst of words. He's in the cellar, with a team from some tech company. They're installing sensors. He called the matriarch our primary fermentation asset. The clinical, detached language made my blood run cold. Primary fermentation asset. He had turned our soul into a piece of equipment. Another text came through a minute later. He asked me where the operating manuals was. I told him it was in your head. He laughed. That was it. That was the catalyst. The moment the despair curdled into resolve. He laughed. He thought my 2 decades of accumulated intuitive knowledge, the wisdom of generations, was a joke. He believed he could replace a lifetime of dedication with a sensor and a user manual that didn't exist. It wasn't about revenge. Not then. I tell myself that, and I try to believe it. It was about justice. It was about protecting a legacy from the very person who was supposed to be its steward. It was about the promise I made to Arthur. I stood up, my knees aching from the floor. I wiped my face, the tears gone, replaced by a chilling clarity. I walked to my study, a small room lined with bookshelves, but I wasn't reaching for a book on winemaking. I was reaching for a set of old, leather-bound journals. My personal logs. For 20 years I had documented everything. Not just the technical data that Oscar had in his logs, but the other things, the unquantifiable, the whys, the intuitive leaps, the subtle adjustments, the story of the matriarch's life. I had recorded the barometric pressure on the days she was most vibrant, the phases of the moon, the failed experiments, and the happy accidents. I even noted the emotional state of the cellar, the days filled with laughter and camaraderie, and the tense days before a major bottling. I had always felt on some level that these things mattered. Now I knew they were everything. Oscar had the company's data, but I had her soul, and I realized he hadn't just pushed me out. He had given me the one thing I never had before: freedom. The freedom to use my knowledge as I saw fit. A quiet heat flushed up my neck. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. And Oscar had no idea he was even playing. The plan didn't form in a single flash of inspiration. It crystallized slowly, piece by piece, out of the cold fury that had settled in my chest. It wasn't about burning the vineyard to the ground. That would be a betrayal of Arthur, of the matriarch herself. No, this had to be more precise. It had to be a surgical removal of a cancer, Oscar, while preserving the patient. My first move was to secure my own foundation. For years, Arthur had paid me a handsome salary, but he'd also structured my compensation in a way that was, in hindsight, brilliantly protective. A significant portion was deferred into a private trust tied not to the company's stock, but to the market value of our top vintage, the one made possible by the matriarch. It was a quaint, old-world arrangement, one Oscar's HR team had likely scoffed at. They had to honor it, but I'm sure they thought it was just a pile of money. They didn't understand its symbolic power. My wealth was a direct reflection of my knowledge. This was a detail Oscar would have missed, buried in paperwork he considered archaic. It meant I wasn't desperate. I had time. I had resources. This wouldn't be a panicked scramble. It would be a patient siege. Next, I needed to understand the battlefield. My leverage wasn't just the secret knowledge in my journals, it was the network of relationships I had painstakingly built over 2 decades. People didn't just buy Dubois wine, they bought from Elodie. They trusted my palate, my consistency, my unwavering commitment to quality. The most important of these was a man named Kenji Tanaka, the head of Vanguard Vintners, our largest distributor in Japan. Vanguard was more than a client. They were partners. Mr. Tanaka was a man of immense honor and tradition, a purist who could detect a single off note in a bottle from across a room. Our relationship wasn't built on contracts and spreadsheets. It was built on long evenings spent in the cellar, tasting from the barrels, discussing the subtle nuances of each season. I remembered one visit vividly. It was a few years after Arthur retired. We were tasting the new vintage, and Mr. Tanaka was unusually quiet. He swirled the wine, inhaled its aroma, and then looked at me, his eyes intense. He said, "Arthur's spirit is still in this wine, but I can taste your hand now, Elodie-san. There is a new clarity, a focus. You have not just maintained the legacy, you have refined it." That was the moment I knew he wasn't just buying a product. He was investing in me, in my stewardship. His contract, I knew, was ironclad, but like all such massive agreements, it contained clauses. Clauses about material changes in quality, about key personnel, about the very essence of the product he was paying millions for. Oscar would see the contract as a transaction. Mr. Tanaka saw it as a promise Oscar was about to break. Then there was my inside source, Matteo. He was my most crucial ally, a young man, barely 25, with more passion for viticulture than anyone I had ever met. He came to us from a family of migrant workers, and he had an almost mystical connection to the vines. He saw the vineyard not as a factory, but as a living organism. I had taken him under my wing, taught him what Arthur had taught me. He was fiercely loyal, not to the Dubois name, but to the craft. His struggle was palpable in his texts. He loved Yonand, the estate, but he was watching Oscar dismantle everything he believed in. I called him, not on his work phone, but on his personal cell. He answered on the first ring, his voice a hushed, anxious whisper. "Elodie, is that you?" I told him to be careful, that I didn't want him to risk his job. He scoffed. "This isn't a job anymore. It's a morgue." He told me about the upgrades. The new team had installed a suite of sensors around the matriarch's vessel, pH monitors, optical density readers, automated temperature controls. They were treating her like a bioreactor in a pharmaceutical lab. They had even taken a sample for genetic sequencing, hoping to digitize the asset, as Oscar put it. I had to smile at that. They could sequence her DNA 1,000 times. They would have the blueprint of a cathedral, but no understanding of faith, of ritual, of the silent prayers that made it a holy place. "Matteo," I said, my voice calm and steady, "I don't want you to sabotage anything. I want you to do your job exactly as you're told. Follow every new protocol to the letter, and I want you to keep a log, a private one. Note every instruction you receive from Oscar, every change they make to the process, and every response from the culture." He understood immediately. "You think he's going to kill her? I don't think he's capable of killing her, Matteo. She's too resilient for that. But I think he's going to break her heart, and the wine will show it." The final piece of my secret plan was foresight. Years ago I had a conversation with our corporate lawyer, a wise old man named Julian, who was a contemporary of Arthur's. We were discussing intellectual property. Julian had warned me that my knowledge was the company's most valuable and most vulnerable asset. He said, "Elodie, what's in your head is legally ephemeral, unless you codify it." At his suggestion I had done something Oscar would never have uncovered. I had established a small independent consulting firm under a generic name, Artisan Oenology Solutions. It was a simple LLC, costing a few $100s a year to maintain. Into this entity, I had poured the essence of my process, not just my personal journals, but I had formalized my intuitive techniques into a proprietary methodology. I called it the Couture method, a bespoke adaptive approach to yeast management. I had it documented, trademarked, and legally registered as the intellectual property of my firm. It was a shield I had built years ago, hoping I would never need it. I had even, on Julian's advice, included a small, seemingly innocuous clause in my last employment contract renewal, a clause that stated that any proprietary methodologies developed by me that were not formally adopted and integrated into the company's official documented procedures remained my personal intellectual property. Oscar, in his haste to modernize and discard my archaic ways, had never asked me to formalize my process for the company's records. He had, in effect, handed me the keys to the kingdom by declaring them worthless. My journals weren't just sentimental diaries. They were the legal cornerstone of my entire plan. It wasn't about revenge. I kept telling myself that. It was about preservation. I was building an ark, not for me but for the matriarch. I was going to save her from the flood of Oscar's ignorance. And if he drowned in the process, well, that was just a consequence of his own decision to stand in the rain and call it progress. The first domino fell silently. It wasn't a dramatic crash, but a quiet, insidious souring. It began, as I knew it would, with the first fermentation batch under Oscar's new, optimized regime. Mateo's texts became a running commentary of a slow-motion disaster. Day 3. The new automated feeder dispensed the nutrient solution all at once, not trickled in. The culture foamed up like crazy. Oscar said it was a sign of robust activity. I knew it was a sign of shock. A sudden glut of sugar was like force-feeding a delicate creature. Day 7. The pH is dropping faster than usual. The sensors are flagging it, but the system just keeps correcting by adding alkaline buffers. It's like they're fighting a war with chemistry. He was treating a biological process like a math problem, ignoring the cause and only treating the symptom. He was giving her antacids for a heart attack. Day 12. There's a smell, Elodie. Sharp. Like vinegar. Oscar is telling everyone it's a normal part of the ester development phase. He read it in a textbook. My heart ached. The matriarch wasn't producing esters. She was producing acetic acid. She was stressed, sick, and turning the beautiful grape must into industrial-grade vinegar. She was screaming, and the only person who spoke her language was on the outside. Oscar, blinded by his own arrogance and the reassuring glow of his new computer monitors, remained oblivious. He saw data points on a screen, all within the acceptable parameters his tech consultants had programmed. He couldn't smell the failure in the air. He couldn't feel the wrongness in the cellar. He had replaced intuition with instrumentation, and in doing so had made himself deaf, dumb, and blind. The panic didn't set in until the first tasting. It was a routine quality check, something I used to do daily. Mateo described the scene to me in a hushed phone call from his car that evening. He said Oscar had assembled the small cellar team, pouring samples of the young wine with a theatrical flourish. He raised his glass to the light, swirled it like he'd seen it done in movies, and took a sip. Mateo said the look on his face was a portrait of dawning horror. The confident smirk dissolved, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. He tasted it again, as if the first sip might have been a mistake. Then he looked at the others, who were trying their best to hide their disgust. "What is this?" Oscar demanded, his voice tight. "Why does it taste like salad dressing?" One of the older cellar hands, a man named Louis, who had worked there for 40 years, just shrugged. "It's what the machine made," he said, his voice flat. Oscar's face went pale. He dismissed the team and immediately started making frantic calls to his tech consultants, to the lab that had sequenced the yeast. He was looking for a bug in the software, a flaw in the code. He couldn't comprehend that the failure wasn't in the technology. It was in his philosophy. He thought he could digitize a soul, and he had just received his first error message. That was my cue. I had waited for this moment for the tangible proof of his incompetence. I spent a full day composing a single simple email. It was addressed to Mr. Tanaka at Vanguard Vintners. The subject line was plain, a personal update. The email was brief and respectful. I wrote, "Dear Tanaka-san, I hope this message finds you well. I am writing to inform you that my tenure as head winemaker at the Dubois family estate has come to an end. I have transitioned out of the company to pursue my own venture, a consultancy focused on preserving and championing traditional and artisanal winemaking methods. It was the honor of my career to work with you and to share the legacy of the Dubois vintages we created together. I wish the estate all the best in their new direction. With deepest respect, Elodie." I didn't make a single accusation. I didn't mention Oscar or the soured batch. I didn't need to. The email was a masterpiece of implication. The key phrases were new direction and preserving traditional methods. For a man like Mr. Tanaka, who had built his empire on the guarantee of unchanging authentic quality, those words would be a blaring alarm bell. It was a quiet declaration that the steward he trusted was no longer at the helm. I hit send. The silence that followed felt immense, like the deep breath before a storm. I had not fired a cannon. I had simply whispered a word into the right ear, and I knew that word would travel across the ocean and return as a tidal wave. Oscar was about to discover that the most important part of his business wasn't the machinery in his cellar, but the trust he had just irrevocably broken. The wave I had anticipated arrived faster, and with more force than I could have imagined. Less than 72 hours after I sent my email, Mr. Tanaka responded. His reply was, like mine, a model of Japanese business etiquette, polite, formal, and utterly devastating. He thanked me for my years of excellent work and wished me success in my new endeavor. Then he added a single chilling sentence. "Elodie-san, your personal oversight was the foundation of our confidence. I have instructed my team to formally request a quality assurance review of the upcoming shipment, as is our right under Section 7B of our agreement." Section 7B. I knew it by heart. It was the key personnel and material consistency clause. It gave Vanguard Vintners the right to reject an entire multi-million-dollar shipment if the product deviated in character due to a change in core production staff or methods. It was a contractual kill switch, and I had just handed Mr. Tanaka the reason to press it. The official notice from Vanguard landed in Oscar's inbox like a bomb. Matteo told me the fallout was biblical. Oscar apparently stormed through the offices, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. He couldn't connect the dots. In his world, employees were interchangeable parts. The idea that one person's departure could trigger a multi-million-dollar crisis was nonsensical to him. He saw it as a personal attack from Tanaka, a betrayal. He couldn't grasp that it wasn't personal. It was purely business. A business built on a promise of quality he could no longer keep. The bad news began to cascade. The failed batch of wine wasn't an isolated incident. It was the new standard. Every fermentation cycle initiated under the optimized regime was producing the same vinegary, soulless liquid. The cellar, once a place of vibrant creation, had become a factory for failure. Smaller, boutique distributors, the ones who bought from us precisely because we weren't a mass-market factory, started to get nervous. Whispers travel fast in the wine world. A bad review from a respected critic, a rumor of a returned shipment, it's like blood in the water. They started calling, asking questions, delaying their orders. The foundation of the Dubois estate, which had seemed so solid just weeks before, was crumbling into dust. This was when Oscar's panic turned to desperation, and desperation led him, inevitably, back to me. He called my personal number. I let it ring 4 times before answering, projecting a calm I didn't entirely feel. "Elodie," he said, his voice strained, trying for a casual tone that he couldn't quite manage. "Oscar, how are you?" There was a pause. He was clearly thrown by my placid response. He expected me to be gloating, angry, something. The simple, polite question was a conversational judo move. He wasn't prepared for. Fine, fine. Listen, Elodie, there seems to be a small hiccup here with the new vintage. A technical issue with the yeast. We could use your expertise to get things back on track. I'm prepared to offer you a very generous consulting contract. He was trying to frame it as a technical problem, a glitch that a specialist, me, could fix. He was offering to pay me to clean up his mess, while still fundamentally refusing to admit the real nature of the problem. It's not a technical issue, Oscar said, my voice still even. The matriarch isn't a machine that needs a mechanic. She's a living culture that needs a keeper. His frustration finally broke through the facade. Look, Elodie, what do you want? An apology? Fine, I'm sorry. Maybe I was a bit hasty. But the vineyard is in trouble. Our largest contract is on the line. We need you. That word, need. It was the first honest thing he'd said. But it came too late. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before I delivered the final cut. The legacy of this vineyard isn't in the soil, Oscar. It's not in the brand or the barrels. It was in the knowledge you called obsolete. It was in my hands. And you forced them out the door. You don't have a technical problem. You have a trust problem. And you can't hire a consultant to fix that. I hung up the phone. The power hadn't just shifted. It had been reclaimed. He had tried to erase me. But in doing so, he had only highlighted the fact that I was the one who had been holding everything together all along. The final confrontation wasn't what I expected. There was no shouting, no dramatic boardroom showdown. It was something far more satisfying, a quiet, desperate surrender. A week after my call with Oscar, I received a formal invitation, not from Oscar, but from his father, Arthur Dubois. He requested a meeting at the office of his lawyer, Julian. I knew then that the game was over. When I walked into the law office, the atmosphere was thick with defeat. Arthur sat at the polished table, looking 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. The vibrant, earthy energy was gone, replaced by a weary sadness. Oscar was there too, sitting beside his father, but he wasn't the same arrogant man who had fired me. He was diminished, his suit now looking not like a uniform of power, but a costume he was no longer entitled to wear. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Arthur spoke first, his voice raspy. Elodie, he began, I have made a terrible mistake. I entrusted my life's work to the wrong hands. He looked at his son with a profound disappointment that was more punishing than any anger. He explained the situation. Vanguard had formally rejected the shipment. 2 other major distributors had followed suit. The estate was facing financial ruin. They couldn't produce a single sellable bottle of their flagship wine. They were, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. Then came the offer, a desperate, last-ditch plea. They offered me everything, my old job back, with the new title of president of winemaking, a significant equity stake in the company, full autonomous control over the cellars. Oscar would be reassigned, moved to a sales role in another country. They were offering me the keys to the kingdom they had tried to banish me from. I listened patiently, my hands folded calmly on the table. For a moment, I considered it. The poetic justice was tempting, to return as the conquering hero, to sit in the throne they had tried to deny me. But then I looked at Oscar's resentful, broken face, and Arthur's exhausted one, and I realized something. It wasn't about revenge, and it wasn't about vindication in their world. Returning would mean I was still playing their game, living in their house, bound by their name. I had built my own house now. I took a slow breath. Thank you for the offer, Arthur, I said. My voice soft but firm. It's very generous. But I'm not looking for a job. I slid a folder across the table, the same way Oscar had slid his severance offer to me. It was a proposal from my firm, Artisan Oenology Solutions. They opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was an offer to purchase a single asset from the Dubois family estate, the complete living culture of the matriarch and all its physical containment equipment. The price I offered was nominal, just enough to be legally binding. $1. Arthur looked at me, his eyes wide with confusion. I don't understand, I explained. Your company is insolvent because you can no longer produce your primary product. Your brand is worthless without the wine. Your land is just land. The only thing of value you have left is the one thing you don't know how to use. I am offering to take that burden off your hands. This isn't a negotiation. It's a rescue. I have pre-signed contracts with Vanguard Vintners and 3 other former Dubois clients, all contingent on me delivering wine, produced from that specific yeast culture under my new label. I can save the lineage of the wine, but not the name of the house. Arthur finally understood. He looked at the proposal, then at his son, and then back at me. A single tear traced a path through the weathered lines of his face. He just nodded. It was done. I hadn't taken the throne, I had simply walked away with the crown. The new reality had set in. The Dubois estate was a hollow shell, and I was the keeper of its soul, free to give it a new home. The resolution wasn't a triumphant party or a splashy headline. It was quiet. It was the feeling of rightness, of balance restored. A few weeks after the meeting, a climate-controlled truck, hired by me, arrived at the Dubois estate. Matteo, who had resigned the day after I hung up on Oscar, was there to oversee the transfer. He carefully supervised the moving of the matriarch's vessel from the cellar she had inhabited for a century. It felt, he told me later, like a sacred procession. She was leaving a place of neglect and moving to a new home where she would be cherished. Our new home is smaller. It's a boutique winery I purchased with the trust Arthur had set up for me, and with the advance from Mr. Tanaka's new contract. It's not a grand estate, but it's ours. The sign at the gate doesn't say Dubois. It says Couture Vintners, a nod to the method I had protected for so long. Matteo is my partner now, not my junior. His youthful passion, combined with my experience, has created something new and vibrant. The matriarch is thriving. In her new custom-built cellar, free from the hum of aggressive technology, she is producing the most complex and beautiful wine I have ever had the privilege to create. The first vintage from Couture Vintners sold out before it was even bottled. The story of the matriarch's rescue became a quiet legend in the wine world, a testament to the idea that true value lies in knowledge, not infrastructure. As for Oscar, I heard he left the country. His father sold the remaining assets of the estate, the land, the buildings, the now useless equipment, for pennies on the dollar to a corporate beverage company that now uses it to produce generic mass-market table wine. The legacy of the Dubois family is well and truly dead. But it was never about revenge. I look at that phrase now, and I see the truth in it, but not in the way you might think. Revenge is a destructive act. It's about tearing something down. What I did was an act of creation. I didn't destroy the Dubois legacy. Oscar did that all by himself. I simply saved the most important part of it from the wreckage. I built a new vessel for it, a new future. My vindication doesn't come from Oscar's failure. It comes from my own success. It comes from the look on Mr. Tanaka's face when he tasted our first wine and nodded, a slow, deep expression of perfect satisfaction. It comes from seeing Matteo's pride as he walks through our cellar. It comes from the quiet hum of the matriarch, happy and healthy in her new home. This story isn't about getting even. It's about getting what you've earned. It's about understanding that your true worth isn't in a title or a salary that someone else gives you. It's in the knowledge you carry, the skills you've perfected, and the integrity with which you work. They can take your job, but they can't take who you are. Your value is portable. It belongs to you. And sometimes, the worst thing that can happen to you is the very thing that sets you free to build something that is truly your own. So I want to talk directly to you for a moment. To everyone who has ever been made to feel obsolete, to anyone who has been overlooked, underestimated, or erased. Your story does not have to end there. Your worth is not determined by someone else's inability to see it. The knowledge you hold, the experience you've gained, the relationships you've built, that is your power. It is the core of your professional soul. Do not let anyone tell you it is worthless. Protect it. Nurture it. And if the day comes that you are cast out, remember this: they are not taking something from you. They are setting you free. Free to build your own table instead of begging for a seat at theirs. Free to write your own story in your own name. If my story resonated with you, if it felt familiar, or if it gave you even a small spark of hope, then please do me one more favor. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time you knew your own worth even when others didn't. And of course, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so we can continue this conversation. Because we all deserve to be the architects of our own lives.